Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Goethe-Institut, I'm very happy to welcome you all here for this program of the Serpentine Galleries in cooperation with Verso and the artist and writer James Bridle to present his new and exciting book, The New Dark Age, Technology und das Ende der Zukunft, or the End of the Future. We are very happy to have James Bridle here today and also to have Erica Scourti here. Ben will say a few more words about this. And we wanted to emphasize that we're very happy with the ongoing cooperations with the Serpentine Galleries and the whole team. So thank you again to Hans-Ulrich Obrist, to Ben, to Kostas, to Lucia. It's always wonderful to work with you. And that's all from my side. I hope you have an interesting and exciting evening. And I hand over to Ben. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everybody. It's my great pleasure that I'm also welcoming you to tonight's event. I want to express our deepest gratitude to the Goethe-Institut and to Verso. It very much feels like these are organizations that are friends of the Serpentine, and very much there's people as part of the program this evening that are part of an ongoing discourse that we feel very proud and happy to be a part of. So tonight's conversation is in collaboration with Verso, and it's a true pleasure to welcome James Bridle, whose new, highly acclaimed and anticipated book, The New Dark Age, Technology and the End of the Future, was recently published by Verso. And obviously at the end of this evening, there's an opportunity to have your book signed by James, and it's for the very fair price of £10, which is a reduced rate for this evening. And I will have the pleasure of speaking with James this evening. And by way, I didn't want to say too much specifically about the book, but I think I just wanted to give a flavor by presenting kind of two quotes that appear in the first chapter of Chasm. And the first quote is from H.P. Lovecraft. And I think it gives a bit of a summary of the kind of tone of the book. And it also, sorry, it does. And it also underscores kind of perhaps where the title came from for the book. So this is in 1926, and H.P. Lovecraft says, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all of its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in each own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age." Pretty haunting. But I think that what's really important to kind of underscore with this book is whilst it doesn't offer solutions, and I think that James is facing a kind of torrent having published this book in a moment in which technology and Silicon Valley and all of these questions are under extreme scrutiny, and they very much should be. I don't think that this is necessarily a book about solutions, and I hope that our conversation this evening will demonstrate that, and that will show that there are many threads and very many narratives that are being told right now, and there shouldn't be necessarily a dominant narrative. And what he says in the last chapter in the last paragraph of the book, it ends, "We cannot fail each other now." And I think that this really underscores the message, and I think that this is something that's fundamentally important for when we think about these kind of technological systems that are now shaping our society. So with that said, I just wanted to take the opportunity during the introduction to introduce everybody. So James Bridle is an artist, journalist, an editor, and he has written for The Guardian, The Observer, Wired, Frieze, Atlantic. I'm sure many of the people here this evening are familiar with James's work. Also, as part of this evening, it's my pleasure to welcome Erica Scourti, and they are here, who are joining James and myself tonight with their remarkable contributions to this event. Erica Scourti was born in Athens, Greece, and is now based in London and Athens. Her work in video performance draws on personal experience to explore life, labor, gender, and love in a fully mediated algorithmic age. She was exhibited recently in More Than Just Words at Kunsthalle Wien, Bedlam, the Asylum and beyond at the Wellcome Collection, as well as many other recent exhibitions on this long list that I will save right now. They are here as a collective, collaborative practice steered by Helen Walker and Harun Morrison. Very happy to have Harun here this evening. I'm not sure if Helen's joining us. They are currently based in London and the River Lea. Their work can be read as a series of context-specific games. The entry, invitation, or participation can be as significant as the game's condition and structure. Through these games, they seek to create ephemeral systems and temporary micro-communities that offer an alternative means of engaging with the situation, history, or ideology. And we will be screening that film towards the end of the event. So in a few moments, Erica will be presenting Otherhead, a live reading over a text produced by feeding the artist's paper archive, from receipts to press releases, hospital notes to video scripts, through optical character recognition software and the iPhone speak function. And after my conversation with James, there will be time for some, and then after that, there will be a conversation between myself and James, and then that will be followed by a Q&A, and then we will be screening the film. And then, as I said at the end, there'll be an opportunity to meet James and have your book signed by him. And I'm sure at this point, he's come up with many different things that he can write in the front of the books, having been touring the book all week. And with all of that said, for this evening, I just wanted to say that we are eternally grateful to Katrin Sohns and Mario Schroef and everyone at the Goethe-Institut London for working with us so closely and generously on this event, and we very much appreciate that ongoing dialogue and the ongoing relationship. We host many events here in collaboration, as well as Sarah Shin, Leo Hollis, and everyone from Verso for their incredible support. The live programs team, Lucia, Costas, Claude, and Tamar. I should say that a very happy birthday to Costas this evening. It's important that everybody knows it's his birthday. And now, with that said, without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Erica Scourti.
O27, inter eternity of my life, grad. I feel as the night changes. What a mess.
At degrees NW. The angel has their motor on. QW, question equals C8 dash waiting downstairs, and I clash to everything, point one. N an, J on light. IOU, animal bone, wrapped polyester resin. They're playing some kind of game with your guts. Who's fragile, so what? Cookie Mueller puts his pudding. It's none of your wipe memories of your kin, your skin. No, I'm not leaving yet. Also an unnamed tape. Don't you even know? Diagonally, E.
Losse L, U2WNUA, lees gelijk aan uitroepteken /graden.
Don't worry, someone knows the way out of here. I seek everything, then it changes. Mise is C.
7 kin.
To submit our editor commissioning on health, disease and disability, the forthcoming in the series, Amsterdam,
University Press.
Psych QT 1-3, feel it I rhythmic crystals with the A, lang the waves of we, E fragile, G S G. I see the body, mark the body disintegrates, and the interaction beds a relationship to sensuality and anarchy, to the way for the cressy, SQ, which comes up often in a familial artwork, particularly when it features the artist herself.
Is that a formal choice?
Yeah, I think so. It was easy, so easy to be cagey about I'm all in. Januari, Februari, Croy, Nielsen, Kunstverein, Karlsruhe, 2012 und Arms, Maintenan. Generally, just feeling to vouch, manifest your YLDE8 dreams fig. Of ointments, office lost on LSD and friendships, which will then likewise be experienced within yourself at and work with an animal guide while you threw away your life for that jerk. Chief Detective John Golston and the DRM is produced by Chisenhalk Gallery, London, and is 8 ideas for AFAC and the Arts Council England, Ting Age Grams for the Anns, T. And Rue, the London Chest, H0 degrees P81. Alance, Isalmitis, gradu igual ad U.
874/ERQQ 80172.
Sosvan.
SN, poi 1935.
I4. Me, naked, just out of the shower, all clean and smooth. I lay on the bed, waiting for you to give me the speech. I notice that some of my Greek friends are sitting nearby. I don't want to be in just one bed. Degrees I, you. Jokes are often disguised put-downs, especially between cultures you. 88% don't understand. Genoa minuto 4.
Please mark the boxes for Wich 88 Permission TO Allo Filming OR Food.
Resolution hashtag wishing I had someone to deny I felt anything section 3 section and I spent all my sexual urges on you. How's it feel? As Pup considers the juicy vein inhibiting the hints of the feminine to me in my gloves of hungry demons, hungry ghosts. Point 1 R1 Lil touch, Lal tush. His seeping BJSH2, some seep ejecting VL, KGB, e.g. jalousie, impatience. $1,000 per square foot. Are the new Forerunners, Strauwood L, ultra luxury residential tower. If a degrees no one is home, then the development is engineered to purchase prices and to keep the home fires burning with your persona to punto di fi. Maintenance is a drag. It takes all the fucking time. Literally, see imagining jobs that section. The cost of real estate can be spheric, or effacement. They make a new kind of exclusion possible. UMI, AL, MISSY, Ever Wallet, J, Electronico Eisitirio, Provo Flana, Kundup, Terena Papaspiru, courtesy of the artist, Eponimo, full name, NR, Vnos, Isitiriu, Panathinaikos, Platanias, SSBV, Alpha, Decaivro, IQ, M3, RDO, Decaochto, YTQ. Χρειάζομαι την αγάπη σου 13, είναι αλήθεια. Dupe to words I, degrees, slitting Yahoo deep search trap, dot, I gullet, combining bespoke craft along with 3.2x degrees technological processes that are boiling over me and you and E equals section massive QV and D-skill ICU, dot, disorder is fertile throughout. E am upala. Suitability of research environment 25%.
Argument procent 2B
Procent,
procent 80%
procent,
90% 2 briefing
procent.
2 noten procent 2B 2 I.
Affect and agency. This bit needs some work. The voice is also 21 parts of your body. The degrees equals reaches multiple people all at the same go in a way that your body's interior organs cannot. Man, que. It's contagious, like laughter. To mention as oral drivel, supra-oral has your identity ball, Y, J, sosengician, O. Bolerium amocus.
Bolkrium Bob FV.
San Francisco. Now you. Stigmata. On hold. Choke point. Workers' Council. Piles of. So. Road traffic collision at
2151 Dezember 2014 at 1330 HRS.
location I'm sorry to hear that you have been involved in a mad Trotsy collision in the City of London sent. This letter is to outline the folie A of 4:3 sin spit 5 W Vidas Gasworks, Astanau, Exmon, England, KINA. You won't somaticize the first time we touch inside Sainsbury's.
New Crossgate.
Temple, Brow, Naos, Grotafo, με το πιστόλι στο Grotafo, with a gun to his head. Contact, Scallions, blooded, Erexapto, 14 λίρες 51. Fin, Po, Vegan, non-construction, regeneration, Asinatitis, incoherent, mumbo jumbo, like years dot, 1 cent, are 1 cent, and an A to Z of Shroud of Hot Boys with flesh to gobble. I queued up 9 and then cut 3. S4, become a rhythmic, demanding it again. Babe, I never thought of how to seize your macho energy for my own or. My heart was gel for their help and advice, and a special thanks. This is I, the Death, in a second series of Matt's Gallery 3 Degrees Done 4. D, accompany Worst Guy, a video 1111 leader installation by Maxi Axmas Cernet. Copy edited by Ben East, 1967. Mama's Baby, Pupas Maybe, An American Front, Hannah Black at Bodega, online, available. This exhibition is generously supplied by Access Fund England. We Come Publicly Engagement Fund. Institutions can be a prison. This artifact of recent American political history finds video effects in. Spills makes use of price. Through the overlay of a morphing liquid spill, exaggeratedly, painterly, mums, axiux, glili, cube enlarrogates the ego of the observing male. The protagonists need low heat constantly while in wildlife 1 degrees 5. Was crying, but she changed her mind on coming to II3, cling with sweat to power up 1/8 of colon 3. Anne M, 83% voice, says I'm not sure Ahmed intended her book to be an IQ on, and I spent a lot of time in the section on how to be a killjoy, and
Omniscient femelle narrator.
throughout the film they therefore function pedagogically in some way, with Tara Brach, my mom, etc. speaking Z equals. F, Yonagala 1. G83, City of London Police. .uk. Does degrees 1 degrees we /9 degrees 1 you do not as L. What does the entire history of all modern revisions show us? Road of Revolutionary Struggles is NRLC1231 L717 mum YSL at TFT. So 11 history marches inexorably step by step, a storming combative energy with a barter of polarical Esfaunal 888 I oipal are. They are pure presence. Unorolo, Narloan, Isolano. Evost. They demand, they tacker. 0 fluff. Structural indifference, like a 17th century landlord, L because they have no signature, no accent. Q dot, as is, and claim neutrality, radical emptiness, high. Becoming an every woman, who is therefore speaking for nothing Q.
4ww119.4.
The pawn who sits is you. Other head. Other head. Other head. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you, Erica, for that invocation to this conversation.
Okay, let's get into it. How are you doing, James?
I'm very good. Thank you all very, very much for coming on a warm evening. And yeah, thank you very much for having me.
And we're up against the England game this evening. So I wanted to open the conversation with a question of, there's a lot in this book. It's a very significant kind of consolidation of thought and work over the course of I feel like over the course of the time I've known you, but I'm sure that that extends into a kind of lifetime of thinking. I know that it's always been very important for you to publish a book, and for it to be the book. And I very much feel that this book achieves that. But I wanted to start by, if you could talk a little bit about the most significant artworks in this process, because for people that may not be familiar, over the course of, say, the last decade, you've been producing things that I've often referred to as sort of prototypes, to explain ideas that were not necessarily legible, and also for you to work through that process. And given that we're speaking in the context of the Serpentine and we exhibit work and we've worked together, I'd be curious to hear about how those objects or those pieces of software fed into a kind of writing process and how that works for you.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things there, which is kind of why book and why now, that usual question you can ask. And to say that it feels like a very particular book, also, and say odd in that it's not the one that I ever thought I would write, having wanted to write forever. I always thought I'd write a book about the internet and it would have kind of rainbows on the cover, and I'm really glad that this one does. But at the same time, it's also somewhat bleak and not the kind of necessarily quite as celebratory of that culture as I would have maybe thought it would be, which is partly a function of its time. I started writing it, I was given the opportunity to write about it, kind of just at the time of the US election, coming into the Brexit vote, and all the other things in the world, which are always happening. And so that coloured it to some extent. But as you say, it's also a product of working through a series of questions over the last decade or so, which are about how we represent things that are kind of too large for us to see. My work's often described as making visible the invisible, by which I do things like draw lines on the ground to represent drones, which are a thing that not a lot of people see. And that not a lot is always key, right? Because these things are never really invisible. Right? They're invisible to some people and radically visible to other people. And so that trying to negotiate that distance between the things, trying to understand what it is that we can see, what it is that we can't see, who can see it and why some of us can't, kind of forms the basis of this. Because for me, I've always been trying to use these technological processes to make technology more visible to people. And increasingly, I found that those works weren't fully doing the thing that I wanted them to do. Well, primarily, they weren't achieving any kind of change. And I think we'll talk about this kind of paradox as we get into it. But there seemed to be a paradox between this kind of desire to make radically visible these things, and then to say, but then, but now, what have you achieved by just kind of creating another image of this thing? And so the darkness or the cloudiness that repeats in the book is very much a reaction to that actually maybe this kind of visibility is not enough, and possibly even it's a trap.
I'm kind of curious, do you see in the production of a book the possibility for a kind of more significant change? That the book, the way that information travels through a book, and obviously the kind of the speaking apparatus of producing a book, do you, because you gave like a TED talk a couple of weeks ago, the kind of potential of that platform, is that do you see a hierarchy in your mind of like the book having potential to be a kind of more active form in this moment?
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, this book is the opposite of a TED talk, I hope, in kind of many ways. I don't know, to say that the book is sort of more special is like to set it in opposition against other ways of speaking and writing and talking and presenting and disseminating work. I've always put most of my work online. I value that as a way of disseminating. It's hard to get people to read 100,000 words on a web page, and also you can do things with thinking in a book that are not possible, certainly not in a 12-minute talk, not really in a blog post. I think all of these ways of thinking are valid, but yeah, there's at a book length thing, you can set certain things in conversation with each other that aren't possible. But then I hope this will kind of flower back out into the network again.
And I want to stay kind of on the surface before we get into the kind of content. So from new aesthetic to new dark age, it suggests a kind of a journey. And I remember having conversations with you when the kind of new aesthetic blew up, and a lot of people liked the new aesthetic term. The contemporary art world didn't like the new aesthetic term, but more kind of in kind of broader context, it kind of resonated with something that described a kind of mimetic quality. New Dark Age is something else, and I wonder in terms of what New Dark Age is being described, because the term often is used to kind of describe the Middle Ages, and it's particularly used to describe the kind of oppressive nature of religion, and particularly the Christian church, and that leading to a kind of intellectual regression as a result of superstitions. Whilst that may actually not be true.
That's 2 questions already.
Yeah, it's a lot of questions. I guess my basic question is, why the New Dark Age?
Sure. Well, I think the new aesthetic is actually almost a good place to start, though I was a bit weirded out to talk about it. But the thing to say about the new aesthetics, it came from a very specific place. So people who don't know that, it is an ongoing blog and research project, and a kind of surfacing and gathering together of lots of imagery that I felt represented or conveyed something that hadn't been well represented or conveyed before, which was the present, actually. One of the real things that started me off down that project was looking around me at the world and not seeing what I knew was happening in the world. In particular, styles and trends at this point. We're talking 7-8 years ago now, but they're still fairly dominant. The kind of really stupid things, like the fetishization of kind of retro and all the kind of authenticity that comes along with that. The fact that we're carrying around basically supercomputers in our pockets, but everyone's going around dressed as blacksmiths. And you have blackboards in cafes and this kind of what felt like a kind of total aesthetic rejection of the future that I felt was sort of tied to a kind of fear and misunderstanding of the present. And so in the new aesthetic, I started to collect together things that to me felt like they had the sheen or the grain of the present. And though I didn't really know what I was doing then at the time, that aesthetics did mean that. It kind of meant the surface of the thing, like this is what it looks like. The thing is, as soon as you've done that, as soon as you've kind of, here's some things we can gather around to talk about the deeper effect, then we can start talking about the deeper effects, right? So, in the last few years, I've moved into, talked more about the things that kind of underlie that, things like kind of global surveillance and the drone war and some of the pretty dark aspects of this, but for me were kind of impossible to discuss until we got a kind of shared sense of the surface of the thing that was under discussion. So actually it's quite a natural progression to kind of end, or to not to end, but to move through towards this thing that I call the New Dark Age in the book, which is really important to emphasize is actually, again, not really anything like what we think of as the medieval Dark Age, which also was not a Dark Age. Lots of stuff was happening there. We just lacked the records of it. We didn't used to have a lot of insight into the area, so we naively assumed people weren't doing a lot of really extraordinary things then. A New Dark Age is crucially not a thing in which nothing happens. It's not a thing in which, a time in which things are not possible. You quoted from Lovecraft on that. I also quote from, in particular, Virginia Woolf, who wrote in her diary in the early 1920s that she felt we were entering a dark age, and she thought that might be a good thing because the darkness was a good place to think. That actually it doesn't need to be a frightening place. It can be a place of kind of extraordinary possibility, and the darkness. The darkness is I'm trying to set up in kind of. As a kind of time and space in which to think things that we haven't been very good at thinking about before.
You answered both questions in one. Good. So, I feel a great deal of empathy with you in terms of having known you to always be an optimist, and evidently you still are an optimist. It's still there in the way that you're speaking and the subjects that you're addressing, and I've heard you describe yourself as a kind of recovering techno-utopian, and I would very much align with that kind of perspective, because this book, for other people who, and I'm sure there's many people in this room that feel this way of growing up with reading an independence, a declaration for independence in cyberspace, and being a part of various kind of activist movements, horizontal, all of this kind of discourse. There was a time when there was a true belief that this was, it was possible, and in many ways, like, if you relate to that kind of history, reading this book is like a dark night of the soul. And so I wondered, like, specifically for people that have not necessarily gone through that journey and are suddenly, like, in this moment, kind of the kind of info wars that are happening through Twitter and fake news, blah, blah, blah. I wondered, like, what were those, like, key personal turning points for you where you began to turn against the kind of message of technology that you'd been giving previously?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even frame it as a kind of turning against, because I try to really maintain the fact that the technology itself is very full of possibilities. We've just lost control over it, or never had it, and also who the we is in that, because not everyone has lost control of it, and it's definitely being used in certain ways very effectively. Yeah, the thing about being a recovering kind of techno-utopian, like, yeah, I'm one of those kids who grew up on the internet. I had a computer in my bedroom before, when certainly when my parents had no idea what that was connected to, and that it was a huge kind of zone of possibility. And there's a huge danger there of then becoming a kind of old man of the internet and raving about how good it was in my younger days, which I don't believe either at all. There's stuff that the network makes possible now, which is utterly incredible. But the turning points, I guess, are starting to see this thing as being a contested space, as a struggle, and fighting that narrative from both angles. So the fact that, like, slowly the internet became, intensely commercialized, became intensely kind of financialized, became for most people a place of kind of shopping and social ordering, rather than a kind of space of experimentation and possibility, and slowly realizing how much of that was a kind of deliberate shutting down of this kind of its potentially emancipatory possibilities. And so that if one cared deeply about, so I keep using this term, the network, which I prefer to the internet, because when I talk about the network, I mean like the internet and us as one kind of big system. Again, because we always used to talk about the internet as this kind of like other place that you dialed into, jacking into the Matrix, Gibson-style kind of thing. And it just like, it was never that far away, and it was never that other, and it's kind of totally merged with everyday life in kind of all kinds of weird and interesting ways now. So like, I like to kind of bring them together in this figure of the network. And so if one cares about the network and the emancipatory possibilities of it, then you kind of have to go quite dark, I think, to kind of frame it as a struggle, as something that actually is constantly being kind of renewed and redesigned and played out again, and that we need to kind of renew our commitment to it to some extent. And also, there's a weird kind of vein of, I think we'll get to this again a bit later, but of kind of faith and trust in this thing as well. I kind of play this game of going back and forth, but kind of anthropomorphizing the network. But right at the beginning, I talk about this weird moment I had where I was sitting on my balcony watching, of all terrible things, The West Wing. And I was watching it, and the computer, it crashed. And the line that looped over from Jed Bartlett, of all people, when it crashed, was like, how we have the technology to get in touch with you in emergency. We have the technology to get in touch with you in an emergency, right? And it was like my computer was like trying to get me to like say that like this technology we've built is not this complete sense of darkness. It also actually can teach us something about the way that the world is, because the network is something extraordinarily emergent in our culture that I still have this deep belief in, but I do think it's been kind of captured and tainted and changed by some other interests. And so it's up to us to kind of to reread it, to re-engage it, and see what maybe it's actually trying to tell us more clearly about the state of the world.
And maybe to speak to kind of a specific example of that was kind of like quite, I remember it being, I don't know if I said it to you at the time, but it was like quite a profound kind of turning point when, watched you produce all of this work over time that was making visible the infrastructure of the cloud, and the cloud is actually a warehouse on the side of the M25. And there was like that moment when suddenly it was like, oh no, the cloud should be embraced as this symbol of unknowability. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, because that unknowability is like obviously an important thread, and how that kind of happened.
So, yeah, this thing you're talking about with the cloud. So I spent years playing with this big figure of the cloud, and I've been fascinated watching this thing turn from like a little symbol in electrical engineers' diagrams that was just like this kind of little thought bubble shape that slowly expanded to take the entire planet. Right, where now basically everything we do happens in this cloud. Like all your banking takes place in the cloud, all your social relationships are taking place in the cloud. We increasingly do things like vote in the cloud. All of these kind of huge civic things, which we used to have a quite strong kind of concrete sense of, sort of slowly have disappeared into this big, numinous, fuzzy thing. And so myself and a lot of artists, I guess, spent a lot of the last few years trying to bring it down to earth, right? Kind of being able to point at it, much like the exercise of the new aesthetic, like saying, no, this is what it looks like. Because when you concretize it, when you bring it down to earth, when you say that it's architecture and infrastructure, you can read interesting new things in it. So in the book, for example, I talk about the fiber optic cables that carry the internet around the world, and we have this lovely idea of the internet as this kind of incredibly contemporary, emancipatory thing. But if you look at a map of the cables, they're the old steamer routes of empire, right? The internet cables from West Africa come straight back to London still, right? The internet connections in South America are still tightly tied to Spain, and there's a sense of which this kind of that colonialism, which we sort of occasionally pretend we've kind of pushed back, actually just kind of moved up into the level of infrastructure. And again, when you physicalize the cloud, these kind of cloudy terms, you can speak about those things a lot more directly and possibly learn from them and point that stuff out. But in the book, what I also try and do is like kind of turn that metaphor over again and say, once we know that, can we make it a little cloudy again? Because the central paradox of the book is that we seem to have kind of engineered our way to the end game of enlightenment, which is the idea that by producing, by storing, by transmitting and distributing ever more data about the world, by turning the world into just something that can be read as data and computed, the Enlightenment idea is that we will come to sort of some kind of utopian, perfect vision that will make us all kind of better. And we've really been working at that. We've built this planetary scale infrastructure for transmitting all information everywhere to some people, certainly not everyone, as much as possible. And the result is not some kind of like coming together, but in fact seems to be a world completely riven by ever greater kind of divisions and fundamentalisms. So it's like this is what I mean by like listening to the network when it's trying to tell us something. Because it seems impossible to hold on to that belief in kind of data and quantification and kind of information for its own sake, when actually every time we test it against the world itself, it fails. And that's where I start to kind of push towards this quality of unknowing, which is really a question of asking, like, what can we know, what can we think, and what can we do without purely relying on being kind of given an inherently flawed database model of everything.
Maybe this is too big a question, but it's like I'm curious, like how far are you prepared to take that argument in terms of, because it moves from being about technological systems of governance, the way in which the world's structured, into, and you cite the Enlightenment, it moves into a challenge to empiricism and rationality and the age of reason and et cetera, and we're obviously going. I feel like it's obvious to some people that we're going through this moment in which. There's a re-enchantment of the world, and there are subjects that people are beginning to talk about that haven't been talked about for a long time. And I wonder whether it's like the book is saying we need to stop and look here, or whether how far are you prepared to push it?
I'm willing to push it quite far and see where it goes, because like I genuinely oppose to this. Every time I see the end result of these kind of data-based empirical processes being pushed that far, the result is either violence when it comes to things like surveillance and various types of modeling, the use of software for all kinds of and court-based decisions, or these kind of examples, or it's actively failure. So, speaking to like scientific empiricism directly, one of the kind of quite extended case studies I talk about in the book is the development of new medicines. And so, in the last 20 years or so, medical research has intensely computerized and has turned into something that's entirely data-driven, where they've basically built vast libraries of data about chemicals. And, if you think about, our kind of mental image of a laboratory of kind of people in white coats tinkering with jars and stuff has basically been entirely replaced by, in fact, the cloud, right? By huge stacks of computers. And this is like one of the best funded kind of research areas on the planet, this huge industry with cutting edge science and all this stuff. And yet it's failing. In fact, the pharmacological industry's results are declining. They're discovering fewer and fewer drugs. And there's various possibilities of this. But it's been discovered that one of the ways to counter that decline which is literally like a failure to find things within a space in its simplest thing. Like, we know there are combinations of drugs out there, and the machines alone have not been able to find them. But yet, when you put humans back into that system again, something different happens. That there's a way of thinking, it seems, to the human, which is distinct from raw machine-driven empiricism. And that has been kind of increasingly occluded from our way of thinking by this insistence upon what I call in the book computational thinking. The thing that's get baked into our mind, that the world is what is computable, and that we're incapable of thinking of things that don't fit into that model. So the answer is not, if you say how far will they push that, the answer is not necessarily meditating in a cave, though I would occasionally recommend that. It's actually just seeking to resist seeking like the dominance of one particular approach that we really have at this point in history, I feel like, stress tested to its limits, and we are starting to see the cracks in.
Yeah. And maybe to give an example of that, I just wanted to like highlight two of the bits that had the most impact on me. One was, and I guess they're both in the kind of the climate section. One was, I was sat on a plane, and there's a section that talks about the increase in turbulence as a result of more carbon in the atmosphere, and then lists out all of the injuries that have happened on planes. And ever since that moment, I've been wearing a tight seatbelt on a plane at all times. But I guess, that's like a practical thing. Keep your seatbelt on the plane, even if you're sleeping or whatever. It will save lives. But I guess there's more specific, where in the book there's this constant like oscillation of like feedback loops, and I think that's the thing that maybe differentiates it from other examples of texts that try and unpick kind of technological systems or take aim at specific things that are emerging, because it's through, as you read through the book, these feedback, you just get trapped in them, and it's one after another. And here's one for you. So I'll read this one. Carbon dioxide clouds the mind. It directly degrades our ability to think clearly, and we are walling it into our places of education and pumping it into the atmosphere. The crisis of global warming is a crisis of the mind, a crisis of thought, a crisis in our ability to think another way. Soon, we shall not be able to think at all. Which is like, when you're reading this next to the graph of like the current projected, it's like, oh, it's so much worse than I thought,
This is indeed the case. This is indeed the case. And the point so again, one of the things of setting out in this book is to try and ask how we think about these things when all of these things are true. What was I going to say? The comparison in another chapter that I make to climate, between the climate and actually to global surveillance. I talk a lot about surveillance, and there's this bit where I talk about like whistleblowing and how much we know about surveillance, and therefore how much we're capable of acting on it, and particularly reflecting on the fact that kind of 5 years after Edward Snowden's revelations, but 10 years after a whole bunch of other revelations that should have told us the same thing, and many, many other stories, we've still yet to actually kind of grapple with this. And that one of the reasons for that is there's a quote from Ronnie Horn, the artist in the book, who says that that weather is the central paradox of our age. Weather that's nice in the immediate is like bad at the systemic level, right? We like climate change has poisoned our ability to have nice conversations about the weather, because it's always kind of looming there. Just as global surveillance has like made us like, it's kind of coated our phones with this kind of like sticky, nasty stuff. And the result of that was we don't think it, right? We actually actively reject thinking about it. It becomes hard to think because it is that kind of deeply unpleasant. And I guess, though this is not something I said in the book, that maybe the darkness that is a response to that. Like, ultimately, despite all the examples I give in this, like nothing is gained by knowing all of these facts about how many stations the NSA has or the exact ppm of the CO2 in the atmosphere. Just as, in fact, when the story I start the very book with, like when Ruskin started writing his notebooks about how the weather had changed at the end of the 19th century, and he didn't know why it had changed. Like he's often regarded, he says that like the rain's got worse, his garden is spoiling, the clouds are darker in the sky, and he says this based on like studying 1,000 years of Western painting. But he picks up on various things, but he doesn't. And environmentalists have seized on the fact that this was the age of industrialization and chimneys were going up everywhere, and he mentions them. But actually, he doesn't really care about any of that stuff. What he says is that something is wrong in the times themselves. Right? This is some kind of animistic response to the unrest in the world itself, and that's what it feels to me in like unpacking these various kind of horrible scenarios. Is that they're not really the point. The point is to say that like. We have to be aware of something else that's awry, something else that's off kilter in our very way of thinking about the world, and it's in that sense that I invoke this idea of unknowing, of a kind of willful rejection of that form of kind of Western empirical knowing, because it's not helping us address these issues at all.
So, and I'm going to take a slightly different direction now, because I feel like we'd be doing the book something of a disservice if we didn't talk about AI. And I'm sure lots of people wanted to hear about AI this evening, because I feel like this is a hot topic. But jokes aside, you have done an excellent job throughout the book and in ongoing work to elucidate how these systems work, the impact that they have, and the impact that we can't know as a result of black box neural networks and things like this. And throughout the book, you speak about things like Deep Blue, AlphaGo, YouTube algorithms that prey on children. We're not going to talk about that. Deep Dream. And I wondered, in speaking about AI, I guess I just want to bracket it of what do you think is at stake? Because often a lot of your book and a lot of the work that you're looking at the moment kind of uses AI as this emblem or this symbol through which to talk about all of these subjects. But AI is also a kind of specific discourse. And I just wondered, given that your kind of in-depth knowledge of this subject, what you think is at stake in the trajectory that's currently being laid out for the development of artificial intelligence?
I mean, I could give like several different answers to that. The one that I kind of come back to, well, you mentioned Deep Dream, and I just want to like to set the scene. Actually, I just would say something about Deep Dream before I get to that. Just everyone familiar with Deep Dream, the kind of like weird psychedelic imagery that Google came out with like 18 months ago, which they produced by like feeding their these neural networks they developed for image classification, feeding them basically blank images or other images, and tried to see what the machines were looking for in these images. And the thing that came out of that was like these crazily hallucinogenic kind of images of like kind of things, dogs with hundreds of heads, or like particularly, just loads of eyes, which is like deeply emblematic of like Google's and thus these technologies' perception of the world as something to be kind of seen and imaged and kind of gathered in this way. And the thing about everyone was like, oh wow, like the computers are tripping balls. Like it was just this kind of very odd thing. And the thing is that like that was literally a nightmare. Right, the guy I forget his surname, who's called Sergey. He's a Google engineer. Like, came up with Deep Dream in a dream. He dreamt it. But the dream was a nightmare. He then woke up and programmed it. Came up with these images, showed them to the rest of the Google team, who were sort of like, "Whoa, dude! Like, no, like that's not cool." Like they then tried to get Google PR to release them, and Google PR were like, "No, you bury this in a box." And then they leaked online, right? And I have no idea how that happened, but then Google had to kind of own them and like put them out in the world. And then everyone was kind of like, "Woo, that's crazy and trippy." But this is a thing that literally kind of emerged from a nightmare. And so, like, I want to put that. And neural networks are not artificial intelligence, though there's some weird crossovers. They are somehow emblematic of this desire to bring computers into the realm of what we have considered to be human intelligence and human ways of thinking about the world. And I emphasize the nightmare thing to say they're not always coming from what we would consider to be a rational place. Not that I, think that much comes from a place of rationality, but a lot of this imagining really doesn't. And it comes from very odd and strange places, and it's okay to talk about it in that way, essentially, I think. So that's the deep dream thing. Where was I supposed to be going with that?
Trajectory.
The trajectory of that, okay. So
I'd say, like, specifically, the narrative that's being told around AI right now, whether it's like taking jobs, etc.
Yeah, thank you. No, what I was going to say about the trajectory, and the one that I kind of follow and find most interesting in the book, like, we can talk about military applications and we talk about all this kind of stuff, but the one I find most interesting is kind of continually asking, like, what it is we want it for, like, why we're making it. Like at a quite like broad kind of species level thing, because I actually like studied AI kind of 15 years ago when the last idea of what artificial intelligence would be was kind of falling out of favor. And at that time it was largely around cognitive science, around linguistics, around evolutionary psychology, which has thankfully mostly gone away. But it was particularly this idea that we could build a computer that looked like the brain. That kind of was basically like a brain and therefore would somehow magically be more humanly intelligent. And that approach really failed. And it's taken a while to come back to the current wave of AI that we hear about all the time. And that happened by basically ditching everything that was human about this idea and going with something that was far more computationally based and kind of far more other. And so we're evolving, and so we mostly hear about machine learning rather than artificial intelligence these days. And the like practical engineering reason for that is that machine learning isn't really intelligent. But the other thing is it's also machinic. And to even use the term artificial intelligence is to like imply that it's like somehow a fake version of us when it's a real version of something completely different, which is weirdly destabilizing. And so can I talk about the Deep Blue and AlphaGo thing?
You may.
Thank you. The bit that this really particularly hit home was in the AlphaGo match last year when this computer beat Lisa Dole, one of the world's best Go players. And it was billed as a kind of rerun of the Deep Blue Kasparov match from '97, which was this, huge built-up man versus the machine thing, where the world's greatest possibly ever chess player was pitted against this computer that had been designed specifically to beat him. And it did, but it did it basically in a way that we understand, in a way that we fundamentally comprehend what Deep Blue did to beat Kasparov. And what it did was it basically kind of outgunned him in terms of the fact that it was capable of holding more board positions in its head. It's pretty simple. It just had more memory storage capacity and kind of live memory than a human does. So it could think more moves ahead, and it could see more outcomes, and it just brute forced the problem. Go doesn't work like that. Go's too complex, even for the supercomputers we have now. So we had to build something that properly learned, that could think about its moves. And that's what AlphaGo is. It's a neural network, a machine learning system. And it was pitched against Lee Sedol. And in the third game, the first two games are relatively easily matched. And then in the third game, about halfway through the game, AlphaGo plays this move, which is unlike any move that's been seen before in Go. You know, a game which has this extraordinary history and strategies and all these kind of things. It plays this wild, crazy move. And Lee Sedol's actually leaves the room for like half an hour to think about it. The commentators are speechless. You can watch the kind of live thing. The commentators don't know what to say for ages. And then they start discussing like, oh, well, it's broken. Like it's a ridiculous move. And it takes like another little while of gameplay to see this is one of the greatest Go moves that's ever been played. Like no one has ever seen a move like this. It completely wipes Lee Sedol off the board. And he dominates the next few games. And the thing is, we will never know why it made that move. Its processes of thinking about the game and understanding the concept of Go itself are enmeshed in a neural network structure that is ultimately beyond any human brain's ability to map. We will never know what it was thinking, which is, on one level, just like sad. Right? On another level, it's beautiful. Like the machines are like opening up this extraordinary territory that was never accessible to us before. But they're going to do a lot of it without us. And again, like in many ways, fine, okay, but that's what's at stake. Mm-hmm. Like the thing I would tip over into slightly is also to say we're really, really, really bad at considering the urgencies and agencies of non-human things. That's a big part of why we're in the horrific mess we're in now. It's bad enough how we treat each other, but like how we treat the planet, how we treat other species is a big part of like the kind of inherent violence that humanity seems all too willing to demonstrate. And so this thing that I keep circling around, like what is technology here to teach us? Like maybe it's one of the things we're going to have to do is raise these little robot friends or killer death robots, or whichever one we're deciding we want to build, and going to have to learn to live with it and learn, how to work with and cooperate and think alongside and acknowledge the presence of other intelligences, other agencies, and one hope might be that actually makes us better.
I'm going to skip my question on the AI arms race.
Okay.
There's something that I really want to get to, so I'm conscious of time. So how am I going to quickly speed through AI? I think maybe I'll just jump towards the end because there's something about myth in your book that's not been, I don't think, been dealt with enough. It hasn't necessarily been kind of brought to the surface in other conversations. But before we get there, I guess there's an interesting set of dialogues that were developed around the Serpentine Marathon, and particularly Kenrick McDowell talking about the idea, what we can see happening in Silicon Valley and with the development of AI, that predominantly it's been based on a kind of Judeo-Christian belief model, and this is why we end up with the narratives. But we can't see that because Silicon Valley, for the most part, presents itself as atheist or agnostic. And to speed through in terms of kind of myth and thinking that through, but you can maybe respond to some of these specific points. At the same moment as we have that kind of illumination and the return of belief and return of religion, and we begin to reframe our relationship to artificial intelligence in like, well, maybe we shouldn't actually treat it like an evil kind of God, because that might replicate existing narratives of control. At the same time, we're seeing this really interesting thing emerge with respect to kind of divinatory practices. So like AI presents itself as a tool that can predict the future quite often, but it too often actually just mirrors the past back and pretends it's the future. And in this kind of return of divinatory practices, you're seeing like a huge rise of people paying attention to astrology and kind of classic forms, tarot, things like this. And I just wondered, I mean, you kind of swerve around the edges of this subject, and I know that it's something of interest, but I just wondered that kind of polarity of the kind of like super technical rational systems versus the return of belief. And, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
And I'm compacting 4 questions into one. But I guess what are your thoughts on that?
It's like interesting magical times right now, and that's good. I say that as someone who basically think on some level that I invoked the whole new aesthetic crisis by repeatedly putting a slide of Aleister Crowley up every time that I talked about it, as a way of talking about what happens when you name things, and that there's a history to doing that's valid and interesting. The kind of I don't know, do we have a term for it yet? The kind of like magical or mystical awakening, or whatever it is, this kind of constellation of thought that seems to be going on at the moment and producing lots of really interesting artistic and theoretical work. I see, possibly, this is my reading of it at the moment, is that it's actually an attempt to like reassert agency over those things that we don't understand, right? Because ultimately so much of human history, and particularly of religious and ritual history and mystic history and all this kind of stuff, is basically like how you propitiate systems that you don't understand. You don't understand how the weather works, but we've learned to do this particular form of ritual or something, and maybe that's going to work. And I think there's a direct line from that to attempts to kind of reassert an agency in the present, which is not to say that those things are meaningless. I don't mean that by any stretch of the imagination. I think there's a huge amount of power and thought in them. And as I say repeatedly in the book, this kind of ability to, like, literally, how do we live amongst vast and dangerous systems that we don't understand? Because the whole idea was that we were taming everything, right? And we were making it all like safe and good and things we don't have to worry about. And now we're inviting, things into our homes and into our pockets that we don't understand and that may contain all kinds of strange dangers. And if we don't understand that, we need some way of balancing that. And so mystical practices have always been a way of asserting agency in a situation you don't understand. And I think that's a really productive way to think about it. But the other thing that I talk about in the book is also like how you give voice to and acknowledge and live alongside like simply other ways of telling these stories and other ways of thinking about them. One of the stories I talk about in the book, which I took from Susan Shupley's work, is her accounting and several other authors' accounting of certain First Nations people who have been talking for some time about they've been saying that the Earth is off its axis. And what happened, this really interesting thing that Susan Shupley documents in one of her works, is that a few years ago, a bunch of First Nations people were invited to the COP16, the big climate conference, and were basically as these sort of like native witnesses to the problem, like, we bring these people and they will speak with the authentic voice, but please don't say that thing about the Earth being off its axis, because it like weirds out scientists. And they said it was off its axis because they were like, the sun is setting in a different place. Like the land has changed to a radical degree that something is afoot on the planet, and this was how they rendered it, and they've continued to insist upon this. And it's possible to say that they are, the atmosphere is filling with dirt and particles that weren't there before, and it's doing that most at higher latitudes. And the same sunsets that you see go red over like smoggy cities because of like more crap in the atmosphere are affecting higher latitudes more, right? So of course things look differently at the poles than they did before, but at the same time, like, I think it's really essential to resist just going like, oh, but they mean this when we say it in scientific terms. That like to actually engage with this stuff thoughtfully and critically, it's really necessary to hold both those ways of talking about what's happening kind of equally, with equal value and with equal amounts of thought, because it's quite clear from our inability to act on climate change that our dominant ways of talking about it are radically insufficient. So the urging in the book is to kind of constantly seek out different ways of talking about what is happening with, whatever tools you have to hand, frankly. Use whatever's in the pouch to talk and think about this thing.
So I just want to give a few examples, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll collapse these questions. So it's interesting in the complexity, in the conclusion to the complexity chapter, you invoke Hermes as the kind of mythical archetypal figure that we should look for guidance in thinking through complexity. At other stages in the book, you invoke kind of Thor and Thor's hammer and the ability to imbue objects with metaphor. And perhaps my favorite kind of myth-making, and this is specific to the question, but perhaps you could talk about the use of those other myths, is the example given of the priesthoods in ancient Egypt during the annual ceremony of Osiris. Perhaps you can explain this example, but the question is like how they executed control and how there are parallels to the kind of systems of control that are present in the world in this moment.
I mean, yeah.
Maybe explain
this is
what
just
happens.
this is just ancient power at work. From the moment we developed technology, it was used by those in power against those without it in various forms. And if you don't know this example, it's the fact that Egypt built a millennia-long dynasty of extraordinary power and wealth that was very violent to most of its subjects, that placed all of its wealth and power at the very center in the most extraordinary, elaborate kind of mythic structure that, one of the most extraordinary ones anyway, that the planet has probably ever known. This just vast repositories of storytelling and myth and all of this thing. And at the heart of this was a scientific instrument that they didn't tell anyone about. The Egyptian priesthood that created the pharaohs and everything else had a series of secret wells along the Nile in which over centuries they marked how high the Nile rose, so that every year they were capable of predicting, based on the rising tide, whether that year would be a drought or a flood, a catastrophic flood, or like a good year in between. And that they could use that as a way of controlling the populace. They could set taxes and do all this kind of stuff, but they could also perform these incredible rituals of kind of summoning and all of these kind of, practices of power around this thing, because they'd got a technology that they were actively hiding, that only they really even understood could exist. That actually kind of precedes all of this talking about myth, really. But it's really about this point of realizing that technology is, it's right back to what I said at the start about realizing the kind of struggle that's inherent in our thinking about technology. And also pointing out that this is really not new in any way, right? This has always been the way these things are used. But that to say that technologies are always held and kept secret to some extent, and will always be used against those with lesser power and lesser understanding, which is part of a kind of wider thread in the book of talking about the kind of absolute necessity of democratizing, for want of a better term, technology, but also crucially democratizing our understanding of technology. One of the problems I kind of address in the book is how do we all talk about technology, in a way that all of us can get involved in this conversation, because we've always known priesthoods are we haven't, but it's always been proved in the long run that priesthoods were a bad idea, and we're really heavily invested in a kind of technological priesthood right now. So the necessity of working out pretty rapidly how we pull back from that is the story of the Nilometer.
Thank you, James. I think we'll throw it open to questions at this point. So if anybody would like to raise their hand. And Zurich, do you have a question?
Yeah, many questions. Thanks so much for this conversation. I wanted to ask, because Ben started by saying, it's unusual for you to write the book because you've done so many things in your practice. So I was obviously very curious if this book will lead to another book or if it's a one-off.
I super hope so. I really like writing. So the reason that's, I guess I'll draw to is there's kind of 10 years of silly things that I've done on the internet in this book also, which makes it sound like a memoir, but it sort of is. So it's like, I'm a bit nervous of of building up that kind of knowledge. I think that has to be, not least because, in this book, I made a very, very firm decision not to solutionize, essentially, not to tell anyone what they should be doing, not to propose any kind of magic solutions for this. Magic, good word again. But simply to state what I saw as kind of present conditions as clearly as possible, because I don't think they're being stated very clearly very often. And it's weird that I use that term clear when I'm deliberately also clouding. But I'm gonna do that gesture again of holding these things kind of equal and possible. So yeah, I'm not gonna stop writing. I don't know if there'll be more books, but this is the statement of a problem, and more thinking happens after that.
Only right to take a question from Erica, and then the second question is over here.
Thanks for that. It's really interesting. As you know, we've talked about it. I've read the book, and just also with you mentioning some examples here in terms of the First Nations people understanding of climate change and the movement of the sun, but also the scientists' grasp maybe in the medical labs, which goes beyond the computational and might be something almost intuitive. So I was thinking about this as being almost a call to pay more attention to embodied knowledge and the experience that is kind of bodily and held, which is, of course, something that feminist theorists have been talking about for a long time. But at the same time, and obviously this is also one of the things that's missing from AI, isn't it? This idea of the kind of disembodied brain. What it's missing is maybe embodied knowledge. But at the same time, of course, all of this is being quite aggressively researched, isn't it, in Silicon Valley in terms of effective computing and quantifying the voice and feelings. And so I was wondering if you've got any thoughts on kind of how that embodied knowledge can be held without also then monetizing it and kind of controlling it and turning it into another thing to control a kind of wider population through.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the answer of how it can be held, but I think it's really worth emphasizing, as you've said, that there's a lot missing from this, because it's missing from my own knowledge of coming to this largely from a kind of technological background and from certain, and my own personal background and understanding, that many of the questions in here have been very, very well sketched and addressed by feminist thinkers and queer thinkers and a number of other people in very important ways. I mean, one of the things I mentioned, it's half a line, but I thought it was really important, was to say, when I rant grandly about the new dark age, is that many people have always lived in darkness of various forms. And by which, again, I don't mean lack of knowledge. I mean where they're not being spoken of, or their contribution is not recognized in all these kind of ways. You could read the whole book probably as me going, oh, the body. Maybe it's not all computers, and how ridiculously belated that kind of realization is. I don't know enough about the practices that you're talking about at all to say how they can be held away from the things that are eating everything else, because you say they're already not being. What they can do is amplify certain voices and other perspectives. It's my hope, even though I rag on the internet as much as possible, and it's this dark, grim place of fighting, often, particularly at the moment, it's also a place in which amazing flowerings of identity and self-presentation are occurring, because it does convey a certain visibility on things that were hidden before. And that's an amazing thing for me to see. I have no, the how we admit other voices and other storytelling. I want to, because I just read it mentioned in another book, which is Claire Evans's Broadband, which is because in the first chapter of the book I talk about a history of computers and how they were built and how they were developed, and it's a very, very partial history. And then Claire Evans' book, Broadband, which has just come out, she talks, it's a history of the women who built the internet, essentially. And it's just ridiculous how few of these stories have been told up till now, and how central they are, and how this history, like the actual history, for what that's worth, is impossible to tell without the contribution from those narratives as well. Like, you just don't know what's happened, right, until that other set of the history is told. And also, it's a radically different history, in that it's one that's not focused on, like, necessarily who wrote one line of code or who built this computer. It's also who were the community builders of the early internet, like who was creating. I think community, a really key part of that, is a history of various internet communities. That, like, also the internet wouldn't have happened. It wasn't just, you know, nerds in Silicon Valley. It was the people who lived it and experienced and embodied it. So I don't know what the answer is to it, but I'm pleased to see that there's many, many ways of kind of writing it out and making it visible. I can hear you.
You alluded when talking about the AlphaGo experiment, and then your work on children's programming, which was to talk about, but the brilliant piece on Peppa Pig, the self-replicating algorithms that appear to be outside human control. And I just wonder whether this is connected in any way to what fellow visionaries like Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking said before he died, that the greatest threat to humanity is AI. Is that something you subscribe to? And is there a possibility that this becomes unstoppable and out of control?
So the question, if that microphone wasn't doing it, is given some of the examples we've talked about, the AlphaGo and stuff like that, the stuff I talk about YouTube in the book, like basically is there a chance for some kind of like breakthrough of AI, like Stephen Hawking warned, like Elon Musk, who whatever. But as people have warned, I mean, yeah, but it sounds really flip, but I really love saying this. Like, we already have artificial intelligences living amongst ourselves, and they're called corporations. Like, we already created very complex, algorithmically run, intelligent systems that operate. And I mean, if we put the AI inside a huge battle bot with machine guns on it, like, that's the danger. Or if it tries to turn everyone into paper clips, like, that's a real possibility and a danger. But like, corporations are already trying to turn people into paper clips. By all of which I mean is like, AI is a really interesting thought experiment, which is not to say that it's not going to happen for real. But like, for me, my interest in it is as a framework for thinking about the non-human, about complex systems, about things that are not within the control or even the full understanding of any one, certainly not one individual or even any one group or of any kind. I think we have much bigger things to worry about than the soon emergence of a malevolent AI. Like, worry about it all we want, but like, I'd rather think about it in terms of how, by thinking about AI, we can think about a lot of other like really big systemic issues that have been with us for some time and are doing much more damage in the present.
Do we have other questions? Got another question over there. I've got more questions just in case.
No.
Okay, I haven't quite formulated this question, but so I heard an amazing thing today, which is that the ground under central London is now 10 degrees hotter than it was 100 years ago because of tube trains just running constantly, 365 days a year. The heat from those trains has actually made it's changed, the geography of the underground of central London. And I have kind of mixed feelings about that because obviously the tube is a great thing because it stops people driving. But then, how do you feel about, the sort of dependence, like this creeping dependence on new technology? I mean, obviously the tube's not new as such, but it's that kind of feeling that the more we use it as a crutch, the more we will depend on it.
Do you want to take an answer? This is the central paradox. I mean, because, I genuinely want you to come in on this one, because, ultimately, that question for me, and maybe I'm wrong about this, presupposes, either it's kind of acceleration until we all boil to death, or go back to the cave. I don't, the answer is going to be, somewhere between those things. And we're not going to magically fix that thing. The thing that I focus on, as I've said, is how we see the ways in which the technologies we're dependent upon have been the ways in which they've been developed, right? So whether they've been developed kind of originally as military systems and brought into civilian life, whether they've been developed as kind of industrial corporate systems, what are the logics that have put this particular configuration of technologies in place? And how, given that we're not going to step back from making stuff, do we make stuff in ways that, is at least not the way we've been doing it thus far? Because we can see the outcomes of the way in which those things have been produced so far and the logics that have underpinned them. And we're seeing the results of those things. And so, yeah, the main thing I guess I concentrate on in response to that question is, how do we open up wider participation in, conversation around, and thinking about the things that we're making and doing, freeing up more and more people's agency to be part of that process. That's... I really want your opinion on this one.
I think the reason you want me to say something is just because my response to a lot of this has not necessarily been to try and work through the... I guess maybe it's taking something of an embodied approach of how does one examine a daily practice, and how can you exit through, in some ways, how can you exit out of technology through the body? And I think, there was a Ted Kaczynski thing in here that I didn't bring into the conversation, but Ted Kaczynski is an important, and that I don't support the Unabomber, but Ted Kaczynski is a really important figure in terms of seeing the very, he must, how did he do it? He saw very early on the potential in cybernetic thought and the Rand Corporation, everything that this was going to lead to, and he took a very extreme approach, and he went to the countryside and he made bombs, and that's not something to advocate for. But it's interesting that we're trapped in this kind of conundrum of in my own work, I've attempted to go into the countryside with a bunch of techno-utopians and try and work through a different practice, and there's something that pulls everyone back to this, something about the kind of attention economy and things like this. But I don't know how I can speak directly to this question without unpacking all of the kind of weird stuff that I'm going through personally in respect to this practice. But I would personally gesture very much towards looking at monasticism as not necessarily sitting in a cave and meditating, but looking at the way in which a structured life, the bare life, combines work and life, and how that shift in form of living allows you to inform a set of decisions over time. The monasteries give rise to, time, keeping, all of the many different agricultural processes as a result of living out a different structure of life. And I think that that's kind of what we need to do. And I think that within what we've been given, if we do return to the kind of cybernetic discourse of design patterns and things like that, there is the potential to take some of these bits apart and put them together to form something else. And I'm not sure why we're not doing it. I put it down to Saturn and Capricorn, and I think in 2021, joke, maybe, but there is this kind of moment coming, and that we will reestablish our agency once we understand kind of I think this is a moment of just a reckoning.
Thank you. That's what I want you to say.
Any other questions? No.
One of the things that the imaginative leaps that developed, one of the things that I think is fascinating about it is the conversation around the network and the idea that it's this scale tool for introspection that our species has created. You say this phrase, and I think it's just a very surprising way of thinking that just opens up and creates a kind of new space in our ways of understanding of this.
So that like planetary scale tool for introspection is the thing. There's like one of the weird things about the internet is that no one set out to create it, and no one knows what it's for. And like people were building all of these bits of things, but we created this vast network, right, which is encompasses everything, that is expanded out to the scale of the planet, and we did it unconsciously, and now we make more and more stuff with it that we also do partially by accident, by kind of poking and prodding it. And I call it, in the book, I call it an unconsciously generated tool for unconscious generation. And I refuse to believe it doesn't have some kind of purpose, right? Not in a teleological sense, not in the sense that like it's been sent from God to direct us, but like we can use it for stuff. And the very least we could do is use it to think about ourselves.
There's a question.
As you mentioned, I think I have a loud voice. One or the other. As you mentioned, teleological, and you know, we talk quite a lot about your title, about the new dark age, and you declare being optimist at the same time, and by now we know that dark age, probably they were not that dark. What I want to concentrate is a bit the end of the future.
What's that?
Your choice.
No, sure. No, I mean, sorry, that's your question.
Theological and.
So what, where that part of the title comes from is actually one of the real triggers for the book, and actually from the title as well, which I read an article in the paper called the title New Dark Age before I even came across the Lovecraft quote, and it was an article by someone who runs the American Weather Corporation, which is one of the largest US-based weather forecasters in the world, and one that kind of pioneered the use of data pioneered the use of vast amounts of data, right? It like concentrated on increasing its weather stations and gathering more and more information to feed ever more powerful computer programs in order to be able to predict the weather. What's happening, and it's too late to go into, but like there's a lot of meteorological stuff in the book, and I cite a lot of the development of computation and this, even the thinking about the future itself as this kind of process of divining the weather. But what's increasingly apparent is that despite all of our data and all of this information, our ability to predict the weather is starting to falter again. It's taken us about 100 years to get good weather forecasting out to about 7 to 10 days. Which is pretty, like we can see 7 to 10 days into the future. That's amazing. But unfortunately, climate change and the increased instability of the planet means that our models aren't working as well anymore. And we're getting more and more freak weather events and these kind of strange occurrences. It sounds kind of mystical, but it just means that things are more complicated than we're capable of modeling. And so that horizon of predictability is starting to come back towards us again. Our weather forecasting is going to get worse. And as a result, all of our long-term forecasting. And so much of our kind of complex, technologized society is entirely dependent upon our attempt to predict the future in various ways, whether that's moving goods around, whether that's sowing and reaping crops, any of these things. It's the ability to predict the future is something that we've based contemporary society entirely upon. That's going to get worse. It's going to degrade. It's going to restrict. And so the end of the future doesn't mean like there's not going to be a tomorrow. It means we're just not going to be able to think so much in terms of like what we're going to be doing in a week's time. I mean, almost literally, which in turn becomes, for me, an insistence upon thought and care in the present. I relate it directly to Aldous Huxley and his insistence at all times on means and not ends, right? On the fact that any philosophy, which includes a philosophy of putting all the data into the computer, munging it, and doing what it says based on what it predicts will happen in the future, rejecting all of that out of hand, because means determine the ends. right? That's what Huxley always says. Means determine ends. And so the means are what we have in the present. The means are what we can do now for one another, and how we behave right now. And yeah, the future is not there for us to grasp in that way anymore. So we need to think more carefully about how we behave right now.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, we have one over here.
I'm glad to hear you because you are trying the best. But I'm as a pedagogic education, I see we have always tried the best for not ourselves, but for all the people. How we can in everybody have their environment, their ability, and if everyone use their job or profession and so on with responsibility, the future could be better, not on the end.
Yeah, I mean, and I think we live in a time when that is, yeah, well, increasingly undeniable. It's undeniability is the term that I keep coming back to. Like, as I said, the way in which the kind of complex technologies are showing us that this kind of data-driven stuff, or as a way of understanding the world, is fundamentally broken. It's also starting to prove some super interesting results around, like, community, democracy of understanding. The thing I'm slightly obsessed with at the moment, I think probably this might be the last story, so I'm going to tell it quickly, is what others have called the technology of ancient democracy. In the center of Athens, they've still got preserved one of these machines, which is a machine for selecting who was going to be in charge of the city. Most of ancient Athenian democracy was run by lot, which is a thing that's kind of gone from our democracy. But most of the offices of state were actually filled by a lottery of everyone who was eligible, which certainly wasn't everyone, but was a chunk of the population. They weren't voted for, they were selected at random. This has started to fade out of our society. The only place it really exists in anymore are jury service. And underlying a lot of scientific research in the form of kind of randomized stochastic processes and so on and so forth, that randomness has this amazing process. And it turns out in a huge amount of technological processes, particularly in various forms of AI, particularly in kind of genetic algorithms and these kind of rather emergent forms of problem solving, that different forms of ability, different viewpoints, different understandings of the world are better at solving problems than any other method we have of figuring out who should be in charge or which particular approach to take. There's a thing, kind of a theorem in this, which is that diversity trumps ability, which is that if you basically take a random sampling of the population for any kind of complex variegated task, you'll get a better result than if you try and select for any particular individual ability. And that should be really obvious, right? But we seem to be at this point where, you know, we need this kind of like mathematical modeling of the thing that I want to completely disavow. But again, if nothing else, like this is what we're building these systems for, to kind of continually show us these things that should be super obvious, like a diversity of opinion and thought is possible, and being better in the present is a better long-term strategy than any other one.
Okay, so are there any burning questions that would be like the worst thing in your life if you didn't ask it?
Or you can also follow up with me outside shortly afterwards.
So I think you mentioned, I'm keeping you on track, you wanted to say a little bit about why we invited Erica this evening, and also because now we're going to also see a film. So I thought now's an opportune moment, given the time, to say a little bit about that, and then
Okay, so yeah, particularly thank you to Erica and to Helen and Harun for being part of this. I asked them because it's fantastic to show more work, and because sometimes, when I'm talking about the book, it's really important to bring in other, as we said, other perspectives, other ways of talking and thinking that are not so language bound in various ways, or that explore language in other ways. Erica's invocation, I won't say too much about it because it's a work in itself, but I felt Erica's approach has always struck me as a way of engaging bodily and in embodied fashion with in some cases these technologies, and that was the aspect of a much more complex practice that I thought would be interesting in this context. Regarding They Are Here's film, We Help Each Other Grow, it's a film that they've been kind enough to show in a couple of exhibitions I've curated, and is a work of incredible beauty and power, and you can read more about the specifics of it in the program that you've got. But yes, again, I kind of wanted to show it just to basically say, like, various practices, and particularly artistic practices, can take these elements of kind of incredible technology and show how they can be used in kind of incredibly humane and thoughtful ways. And again, that's just one small aspect of a practice and an artwork, but it's kind of what I wanted to bring to the kind of closing moments of this, to say, other ways of thinking and reacting and talking about these things are possible, and that they can be, in this case, searingly beautiful. And on that note, I'll leave it to the film. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, James.